Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the first historic visit of a US Secretary of State to Judea and Samaria and the Golan. Program, and today I have two very special and very familiar guests on the program. They are Zalmi Unsdorfer, the chairman of Likud Harut UK, and Robin Benson, Christian political commentator. So welcome to the program. I'll start off with you, Zalmi, because back in the summer I thought we recorded a very special program with you and Colonel Richard Kemp, talking about your father's book, The Yellow Star. What impact did that program have, having Colonel Richard Kemp here in the studios to discuss your father's incredible book, The Yellow Star?
I had a lot of very good feedback from the Jewish community about this, and it goes to the condition of acknowledgement of the Holocaust and what went on during the Holocaust, as the prism through which people like me, who are sons of survivors of Auschwitz, view Israel and the security of having a Jewish state. So I think in that respect, the two are very, very much connected. And then Richard Kemp is very, very much part of that connection in daily life, and his commentary and his support of Israel and his advocacy in various countries for Israel.
Excellent. And good to have you on the programme, Robin. Now, when it comes to Judea and Samaria, what's so interesting is that very few Christians who actually visit Israel get the opportunity to visit what is called the Shomron, or the mountains of Israel, known as Judea, which is where really is the biblical heartland of Israel. Why do you think that so many Christians actually miss out on visiting this very, very special land known as Judea and Samaria?
I think part of the problem is that some tour operators, some Christian tour operators, are just afraid to go there. I mean, in the past, many years ago, when I worked with Christian Friends of Israel, the then director, who you and I know, would always make it a point, Roy would always make it a point to take his groups into Judea and Samaria, but sometimes they had to go in an armored bus, with military escort. So that sort of scenario does tend to put some people a bit on edge, and I guess some tour groups just don't want to go through all the hassle of organizing something like that. But as you point out, and as most of our Christian supporters who are supportive of Israel know, it's the guts of Israel. It's where everything happened that's key to the unfolding history of Israel and the Jewish people. And therefore not to visit it is such a shame, because there are places there that, Hebron and some of the other major biblical sites, that you miss out on a fuller understanding of what the land is all about.
And Zalmi, why is this so special in terms of its connection, its spiritual and historical connection to the Jewish people, Judea and Samaria? Because I was so privileged last year on part of the Christian Media Summit organised by the Israeli Government Press Office to actually go up there and see it for myself, and to see the site of Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rested. You could actually argue that this is probably where Western civilization started, where our foundations of our Judeo-Christian heritage stem from. And yet the world likes to call it the West Bank, or worse, the occupied Palestinian territories, without knowing any historical context to this land. Why is it so special to the Jewish people?
Well, because very little happened in Tel Aviv in Jewish history. That's one thing you can say. I travel very freely through Judea and Samaria all the time when I'm in Israel. I go to Hebron very, very often. I don't have to go in an armored bus most of the time, except when riots have been kind of fomented. as part of some celebration of some land day or part of the struggle. But this is where it all happened. This is, you mentioned Shiloh, we call it Shiloh. It's unbelievable where the tabernacle stood for all those years. When you stand in a place like that, you're standing in biblical history, in the absolute guts, as you say, of biblical history. And it's beautiful to see these areas being reclaimed. Because remember, most of the Jewish landmarks, when the occupation by Jordan was happening, if you want to talk about occupations, Jordan was the real occupier of what they called Palestine at the time, Palestine Mandate. Every Jewish historic site was turned into a stable or a rubbish dump or whatever the case may be. And it's only now that we've been really building since '67, rebuilding Jerusalem and places and landmarks like Shiloh and the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron. It's beautiful to see the flowering of this. And it's not stopping. It's gathering momentum, and it's hugely inspiring to the throngs of Jews all over the world and Christians to see the Bible being brought back to life.
Absolutely. And Robin, there was such a battle over this territory. You won't get very many politicians, sadly, in our Houses of Commons to actually describe this area as Judea and Samaria. Our Foreign Office thinks that this actually belongs to a Palestinian. They reject any Jewish settlers from being or having communities in their ancient homeland, considering that the name of this area is Judea, which very few people will actually realise means the land of the Jews. So how can our Western governments and our mainstream media detach the Jewish people from their ancient homeland of Judea and Samaria?
Well, I was thinking about this coming up on the train, and there's a mixture of reasons in behind all of this. I mean, I don't know what you feel, Zalmi, but my perception is that, say, maybe up until about 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit earlier, that actually the Israeli government did not press the issue that this was the Jewish heartland, at least not publicly in the way that they are now. But I think the San Remo 90th anniversary changed things, because at that point it seemed like there was at last a more vocal recognition of what had been put into the San Remo Agreement and the Balfour Declaration and all the rest of it. And it seemed to turn things, as far as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is concerned, taking on board the fact that there was support out in the nations for the fact that this was the Jewish homeland. But then you have to take into account that for decades people have bought into the Jordanian occupation, as you rightly call it, and therefore the Palestinian narrative that developed out of that. And that is just built and built and built until people don't realize what Judea and Samaria were originally part of. They were part of the mandate they were given to the Jewish people. And for us as believers in the God of Israel and believers in his word, we've reached a time in human history where the Bible is it's another piece of literature for most people. And it's no longer important. And what God thinks about this, which is important to us, is no longer important to the vast majority of the people in the world. It's just, so what? And so for us, we have to then somehow be able to present a case that doesn't negate the biblical aspect, but also brings into the political aspect, the diplomatic aspect, that has gained some momentum over certainly the last 10 or so years.
Excellent. And Zalmi, what is your assessment on President Trump and everything he's done for Israel during the past 4 years since he's been in office?
I think it's quite astonishing what Trump has done, not just for Israel, in total contrast to Obama's farewell gift of kicking us under the bus in the United Nations resolution in, I think, his last 4 weeks in office. And it's not just about Israel and its security. And it's not just about righting wrongs in the BDS situation. And it's not just about putting the United Nations and its human rights joke commission throwing it into its true relief and defunding it. And it's not just about defunding UNRWA, which was basically teaching children in Gaza how to hate and kill Jews. It was the whole wider concept of Jews being constantly undermined and put under attack. Because the bottom line is, some people like Trump understood that Israel in the current generation is the world's Jew. In my grandfather's time, he was a Jew living, in Europe. And the Jews weren't allowed to do this or that or that or that, and they were discriminated against, and then eventually they were sent to Auschwitz. Well, now amongst the nations, Israel is the world's Jew. And it is being discriminated against by that same Europe. Because I can tell you now that the Arab countries, and we're seeing it happening now, and it may happen with Saudi next week, the Arab countries are going to be recognizing Israel long before the European Union does, in terms of Israel's legitimate rights in the Bible lands. Mm-hmm. And to your point, Robin, the issue of the Bible being considered to be just, another piece of literature, I think there's a very good point that you make there. And I think to the current generation of youngsters, yeah, maybe it is just a script. But if that's the script, then the land of Israel and Judea and Samaria is the Netflix movie. Mm. That's what's bringing it to life in living color. Mm. That's really why it's so important. Mm. So Trump has reset things in so many ways. And even if he does not succeed in getting a second term, I think most of that reset is going to be set in concrete. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful legacy that he's left.
Absolutely. And Robin, I think we also have to acknowledge the role played by key Christian evangelicals in administration, the impact that they've had on US foreign policy under President Trump, the likes of Nikki Haley when she was America's ambassador to the United Nations, constantly standing up for Israel in the United Nations. And then, of course, we got the Vice President, Mike Pence, and also Mike Pompeo, US Secretary of State and former director of the CIA, and also others who've had a huge influence on Donald Trump and his foreign policy. Can you share with us what impact you think they've had and how much their Christian faith has had a huge impact in determining US foreign policy towards Israel?
I think it's actually beyond our comprehension. I don't think we fully understand the influence that these key advisors that you've named, plus others, further down the ranks, have had in the whole outlook of the Trump administration on what goes on in the Middle East and in Israel in particular. Because these men have been very upfront in a way that no British politician, would ever dare to be, about their biblical beliefs, their understanding of what the scripture says, and their willingness to stand firm on those beliefs, and then take that into, the very center of power in the White House and advise the president and, the rest of those that need the advice on that basis. And of course, they've had the whole backing of a high percentage of the evangelical Christian community in the States right behind them, cheering them on, get on with it, keep telling this man what the Bible says. And it eventually has had an impact in some of the policy decisions that he's made. And so it's to me, it's as clear as, the whole saying is nose in your face, that these guys have had a key part to play in how this administration has unfolded in its attitude toward Israel over the last 4 years.
And Simon, what do you make of the current visit by the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's the first US Secretary of State ever to visit Judea and Samaria, and the first one ever to visit the Golan Heights? How significant is this tour of his?
I think it's an enormous message. It's probably the most fitting message to the end of a Trump administration, to go on that, what some people call it a valedictory tour, but to go on that lap of honor, because believe me, Trump and Pence and Pompeo really deserve a victory lap after what they've achieved in such a short time. And just remember that Trump has had to do all this under the most incredible pressure of impeachments and the entire media world being against him and academia being against him and all this kind of, he hasn't had a moment's peace. And you know something? I have written on occasion about the amazing comparison that there is between Trump and Jews, because Natan Sharansky once identified the 3D test of anti-Semitism. Delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. And Jews know what that means. You know, we've been delegitimized and demonized and double standardized in every respect. What Israel does in the Middle East is absolutely, you know, is off limits. But the Palestinians can do anything that they like, including terrorism. And look at Trump. From the get-go, they demonized him as some kind of a reptile, and then they delegitimized his presidential win completely, and even till today. They said it was an illegitimate election in 2016. And then they applied double standards, that everything that Trump said was you know, they could condemn him for that. But what Bill Clinton and anybody else did, they get a free pass on. Yeah. So I guess there's a kindred spirit between the Jews and Trump in a much deeper way.
That's certainly from the religious Jewish perspective. I think maybe liberal Jews would have a different interpretation of that.
That's a whole different ballgame.
That's why they end up voting for Biden, which is a shame. Now, let's go to this excellent report put out by Chris Mitchell from CBN that looks into US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's historic visit to Judea and Samaria and the Golan Heights.
Secretary of State Pompeo's visit to the Jewish community of Benjamin served a dual purpose. In addition to its historic nature, the stop at the Pizzagoat winery carried a strong business message. Pompeo declared that going forward, products produced in Israeli communities in the West Bank will be labeled Made in Israel. That move changed a decades-old U.S. policy. Pompeo also called the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions movement, known as BDS, anti-Semitic, and that the U.S. would cut support to any groups participating in it. Pompeo also made the first official U.S. visit to the Golan Heights, which President Trump recognized as part of Israel in March 2019.
You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized that previous presidents had refused to do, that this is a part of Israel, and a central part of Israel.
On Wednesday, the U.S., Israel, and Bahrain marked their first ever trilateral meeting in Jerusalem, the latest milestone in the Abraham Accords.
Today, we're making history again. This is the first ever official ministerial visit from the Kingdom of Bahrain to the State of Israel. It marks another important milestone on the road to peace between our two countries and peace in the region.
Throughout all the meetings, it has been obvious the intention and keenness of all sides to ensure that the peace we are pursuing will be a warm peace that will deliver clear benefits to our peoples.
Pompeo emphasized the message sent to Iran.
These agreements also tell malign actors like the Islamic Republic of Iran that their influence in the region is waning and that they are ever more isolated, and this shall forever be until they change their direction.
Also Thursday, the New York Times reported the Palestinians are considering ending the so-called pay-to-slay program to gain favor with a potential Biden administration. This program pays convicted Palestinians in prison and their families up to $4,000 a month for terror attacks, including murdering Israelis. However, Itamar Marcus of the Palestinian Media Watch tells CBN News he feels it's unlikely the Palestinians will give up the program, since it's such a part of Palestinian society. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has said numerous times the martyrs and their families are sacred, and so are the wounded and the prisoners. Even if we have only a penny left, it will only be spent on the families of the martyrs and the prisoners. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
There we see an excellent report put together there by Chris Mitchell from CBN, and you can watch his programme, Jerusalem Dateline, here on Revelation TV. Robin, I want to bring you into the equation on this one, that here we have President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo literally ripping up decades of US foreign policy towards Israel. Previously, the policy was that the previous US administrations referred to Judea and Samaria as being part of the Palestinian territories, to be ready to be consumed as part of a Palestinian state. But why do you think now he's come up and took the courage to come out and say, no, this land is actually belongs to the Jewish people, and standing on that biblical platform?
Well, I think, as Almi had already said, I mean, it's like a valedictory trip, because as each day passes, it looks like more and more that Biden is going to be inaugurated on January 20th. So I would agree with Almi that they're trying to solidify policies that have been in the pipeline probably for several months, if not a year or two, and just put them out into the public domain, including the things that Pompeo has announced. The recognition that goods are made in Israel, and so on. I have to say, though, I mean, coming up on the train again, thinking about this, my fear is that it may end up being seen or perceived as a token gesture, because it's not going to change the EU's policy on not accepting that items that come from Judea and Samaria are made in Israel. And it's not going to change the EU or the UN's attitude towards these issues. And there's always the possibility, I mean, I cannot think of any way that President Trump can put this into law in such a way that Biden can't rescind it at some point. I mean, he may not rush in to do it, as soon as he gets into office, because he's got so many other problems to deal with, COVID, the American economy, which is going down the proverbial, at a fast and furious rate. He has other things he needs to deal with, but he could get around, I think, unless Trump can somehow ring fence what has been announced by Pompeo. I think Biden may well just, change it again.
Well, I think what President Trump realizes is that the Senate should remain Republican.
Yes.
So it'd be very, very difficult then, with the Democrats not having all three houses essentially, to implement their domestic and also their foreign policy as well. So maybe he's actually hoping that the Senate will be able to pull that back.
Be a check against that. Okay,
exactly.
Well, that's always a possibility, I guess.
And Zelmi, reading a lot of media reports about Mike Pompeo's trip to Israel, there's a lot of speculation that he's really pandering to his evangelical Christian support base in the hope of running for the 2024 presidential elections. What do you make of that?
I would hope that he would run. I think he's an extremely capable person. He's got the right idea. And I think I've always said that the difference between left and right is very, very simple. It is that the left does not believe in the concept of evil, and the right does. So when somebody goes on a murder spree, the left will say, I wonder what happened in his childhood that made him do this. And the right would say, lock him up and keep society safe. And this just permeates everywhere. So Pompeo, obviously started off in the CIA. He immediately saw world threats. He immediately saw what was going on. And let's not forget, that, during the Obama administration, we would see on our TVs people, in red jumpsuits being beheaded by ISIS. Has anybody attacked any American civilian in the last 4 years? No. So he's projecting toughness, and Pompeo projects toughness, and Israel in that region also has to project that toughness, because it's a tough neighborhood. But I still, as I said before, I believe that the Arabs in the region will be much, much quicker accepting what Trump's done than the EU.
And I think there's also the fact, as we've seen over and over and over and over again, President Trump is not a politician. He's a businessman, and he sees things in stark contrast. It's either right or it's wrong. And so he has looked at the intransigence of the Palestinian Arabs and the PA leadership and Hamas and seen these guys have been pandered to for decades. And every time we give them something more, they come back wanting something more. And Trump said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. You know, I'm cutting off your funding. You know, I'm closing down your embassy. I'm closing down your consulate in Jerusalem. If you guys really want to talk, come to the table and talk. Otherwise, I couldn't care less. And I think it's also part and parcel of, you know, as many commentators make the point that America under Trump has been trying to withdraw from the Middle East. And in some senses, let the Middle East get on with sorting itself out. It can't do that fully because what happens in the Middle East will end up in America's doorstep, as we've seen many times in the past. So he can only do that so far. But Biden is coming into a situation where he has some very hard choices to make. You know, he and Kamala Harris have made all the, you know, the right pronouncements in their what few speeches they've made during the COVID crisis to their supporters. But from January the 20th, they're in office. They're actually going to have to make decisions based on what's going on the ground. And as so often we discover, what they say out on the trail ends up being something quite different when they're faced with the stark realities of what's in front of them.
No, absolutely. Salmi, when it comes to Mike Pompeo's character, he would have made a personal decision, wouldn't he? This is part of a 14-day visit of his. He visited France, met with Macron, then went to Turkey. He's been in Israel. Then, you know, and currently, as we record this program, he's in Saudi Arabia, talking to the leaders in Saudi Arabia. But for him, Israel's a special place, and the Jewish people are special to him. You only have to look at his tweets and what he's actually tweeted about his visit. What difference do you think that makes to Israel, knowing there's a Secretary of State that loves Israel, that loves the Jewish people, and wants to do all he can to defend them?
I think it is all about being unapologetic and bold, and this is the whole imprimatur of the Trump administration. So Pompeo is actually going out there projecting the strength that has been projected over 4 years, whether it be against NATO, whether it be against Iraq, and against the Ayatollahs in Iran. And the Iran issue is going to be very, very pivotal. I mean, Robin, you're talking about what Biden will do, and Biden will do. Biden hasn't got a say in anything. If he knows what day of the week it is, that's a good day. But it's his handlers. The only good news I've heard so far is that the proposed designated Secretary of State is a good friend of Israel and has been very pro-Israel in the past. And we must hope that that it's not too bad. But I do fear, on the one hand, that there will be a warming of relations with Iran and a softening of sanctions on Iran. But I also say that, you know, something, we all talked about Iran and how this is an existential threat to Israel and so on and so forth. The Lord works in mysterious ways. What we think today is bad for us was probably good for us, because without the threat of Iran, not that UAE, not Bahrain, not Sudan, and not Saudi Arabia would even be thinking of talking to us. And that's not going to change. That dynamic's not going to change. And if there is a warming towards Iran, and Iran is empowered, that's going to bring the Saudis even more into the ambit with Israel.
And I think that's a key point to hold onto, that if the Biden administration does move towards trying to make up with Iran in whatever form they move to do that, all it's going to do is push more Arab Muslim nations who are scared stiff of Iran towards Israel and making good with Israel. So, yes, as you say, something good in the long term may come out of what effectively, you know, some of us sort of throw up our hands in horror at the thought of a Biden presidency.
Absolutely. I was listening as a matter of interest to an Israeli former general who was talking about the possible warming with Saudi Arabia. And he said that if there's a peace treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel, then the Saudi oil can be piped into Eilat and up through the Ashkelon pipeline and out into the Mediterranean, which means that none of the Saudi oil tankers will have to go past Iran in the Straits.
Amazing.
Wow.
Now
So
that, when you think about that,
Right.
not just in the saving of transportation costs and so forth,
Yeah.
but that is a mega, mega sea change, if you excuse the pun,
Yeah.
not having to go
Yeah.
through the Iranian Straits.
Because that's a major threat that Iran holds over the world at the present time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
An epiphany. I appreciate that. Let's have a look now at US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo together with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu holding a joint press conference. And this is the Israeli Prime Minister lavishing praise on the US Secretary of State.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mike, we've just had a very intimate and productive conversation overlooking the walls of Jerusalem. And it reminded me of how deep and profound your tie is to the Jewish state. I gave you a Bible as a gift, and I said that the people of the book have not had a better friend, and I mean it. And I want to also express my appreciation for our personal friendship and everything that went along with it. So every word that I'm saying here is meant from the heart. I think that the first thing I should do is also express my condolences on the deaths of 6 American members of the MFO in Sinai. You were a serviceman, and you know the pain of the loss of people. They were killed last week in a tragic accident. I sent a note, but I want to say it directly to you. And they were killed along with fellow peacemakers from France and the Czech Republic. So we honor their memory, and our thoughts and prayers are with their families. Mike, we worked together closely for these past 4 years, first when you were CIA director, and then as Secretary of State. And I think that from those 2 unique vantage points, you've seen firsthand evidence of what I've been saying for many years, that the United States of America has no better friend than the State of Israel. And you can attest to that in a variety of ways. But you also worked hard to prove the other thing that I'm saying for many years, and you contributed to it personally, mightily, that Israel has no better friend in the world than the United States of America. And over the last 4 years, under President Trump and his remarkable team, led by you and Ambassador Friedman and Jared Kushner and others, Israel's alliance with the U.S. has reached unprecedented heights. Thanks to President Trump, the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved its embassy here. Thanks to President Trump, the United States recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Thanks to President Trump, the U.S. pulled out of the dangerous nuclear deal with Iran, placed crippling sanctions on the Iranian regime, and eliminated the mega-terrorist Qasem Soleimani. Thanks to President Trump, the United States proposed the first truly realistic plan for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And thanks to President Trump, Israel was able to forge peace with 3 Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. Israel is deeply grateful for all that President Trump has done with you and the others of the team to strengthen Israel and to advance peace. And Israel is deeply grateful to you, Mike, for your unwavering support. You have, under your leadership in the CIA and the State Department, you strengthened the alliance between Israel and the United States. In your tenure at the CIA, intelligence cooperation was made stronger than ever, enhancing the security of both our countries. Under your leadership at the State Department, U.S. representatives at the UN and other international forums have unabashedly defended Israel with no apologetics and no artificial correctives, just defended Israel, defended what is right, defended what is true. America has firmly stood up to the perversion of justice at the ICC, and I want to thank you for your personal involvement in all these things. Everything that I said involves your personal contribution as well. And the U.S. rejected the assumptions about the legal status of Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria.
And then we have the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking so warmly about his friend, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Robin, I have to ask you, how significant do you think that Mike Pompeo's visit was to the Jewish settlement in Judea known as Pesachot? And he actually visited the winery in which they lost their court case in the European Court of Justice over the EU's labelling of products from Israeli settlements, saying that they are produced in the occupied Palestinian territories. Was he trying to send a message to the European Union and those in Europe, but also to strengthen and empower those Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria that are facing the wrath of the BDS movement and the European Union?
I think he was doing all of that and more. Certainly, he's making a very strong point to the European Union. This is where, at the moment, the United States stands on this issue of goods produced inside Judea and Samaria. And he's also sending a message of encouragement to people who live and work there and who are producing the goods, that there's at least one nation on the earth, you know, who's prepared to recognize that these are produced in Israel. They're Israeli products, not of some weird political diplomatic entity. But I think he was also sending a message to the Palestinian Authority, you know, who have been hopping up and down on both feet over the whole issue of the peace treaties that Israel is signing little by little with the Gulf states and other nations. And he's sending a message to the Palestinians. This is happening. Whether you like it or not, it's going ahead. And if you want to be part of it, then you need to stop playing, you know, like children, you know, throwing their toys out of their pram and come to the table and sit down and talk like sensible adults.
Yeah, sadly we haven't got that with the Palestinian Authority. They still believe that they are fighting a conflict that's 70 plus years old and don't acknowledge the fact there is a Jewish state, they're a thriving Jewish state that's not only an economic and military superpower, but is also coming against the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. So they've got a lot to contend with. Zelmi, now what do you make of Pompeo's policy announcements that the goods and produce produced in Judea and Samaria will be classified as made in America. And he also, made in Israel, apologise, and that's for the American market. But he also described the fact that the BDS movement, known as the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions, is anti-Semitic. Very powerful statement on behalf of Mike Pompeo.
Well, BDS is rooted in anti-Semitism, and its roots actually go back to, Nazi Germany, where, you were not allowed to go and buy anything in a Jewish store, and it was marked, Judah. My father saw this, so this is not something from ancient history. This is like, a generational thing. He's basically calling it out for what it is, pure anti-Semitism. I mean, as far as, the oppressed Palestinians are concerned, my first visit to Pesachot, my very first visit to Pesachot, I'm standing over there and it overlooks Ramallah. And I'm seeing this whole vista of beautiful villas, with beautiful tiled roofs and fantastic, real estate. You'd think that it was an Israeli town, basically, but lovely villas. And right in the middle of that, right in the center, there was this gray smudge in the middle. And I asked my guide, I said, what's that in the middle? He says, oh, that's the Ramallah refugee camp. Okay? And that was all that the BBC and other news media would ever photograph of Ramallah. That grey dystopian smudge in the middle of that. Surrounded by wealth and like any other country. So this whole thing is a fake narrative. And unfortunately, the poor Palestinians who are, do not get any of the money that the EU sends, just goes down the drain, goes to Swiss bank accounts or whatever. Arafat was we know all about his millions. But if you look at, even if you go down to Gaza, you see shopping malls and five-star hotels and so forth. You never will see those pictured on any media outlet at all. So it's just a fiction which keeps getting peddled, but I think it's now been run so far down that I think it's been fatally wounded, that narrative. And I think the first people to understand it are the Arab states who were funding the Palestinians for some while, and I think they're fed up with it.
Yeah, and rightly so as well. And Robin, I'm just going to give you a quote now, because Mike Pompeo also visited the Golan Heights. We know that that's in the north of Israel, Israel's border with Syria. And this is what the Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi said to the US Secretary of State. He said, this is what US Secretary of State said, Mike Pompeo, "You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized what previous presidents have refused to do so." Talking about in 2019, President Trump recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. How significant do you think it was that Mike Pompeo visited the Golan Heights and showed solidarity with the people in the Golan?
Well, again, we're back to this whole business of him taking this valedictory tour, and he's making points. He's going to places of significant interest, certainly to the Israelis, and obviously to a pro-Israel American audience who are watching on, who are observing this. And it is significant. I mean, most of us who've done tours to Israel have been to Mount Bental. We've stood in the trenches, and we've looked across the protective fence that keeps you from falling off the edge, towards, Syria on the other side of the valley. So yes, he's making a strong point that there's no way that any Israeli government, whatever their shade of opinion, in their right mind is ever going to give that back to Syria, and especially to Syria under the present regime, who are totally and wholly supported by the Iranians. If Israel was to hand that back to the Syrians, the Iranians would be up on the Golan Heights and starting to attack the Israeli communities down below, as happened when the Syrians had control of it. So Mike Pompeo is making a very strong point. This is Israel's. It has been recognized as such. Whether the rest of the world recognizes it or not, it's not irrelevant, but it's highly unlikely. They won't recognize it because Trump recognized it. Anything that he's done, they'll do the exact opposite. But again, I don't think it's something that Biden can rescind. So there it is. It stands as a recognition. Israel is supported by it. Israel takes heart from it. And Israel will not let the Golan Heights go. Never.
And I think the other important thing to note is that not one Palestinian lives or has ever lived on the Golan Heights. It's only been Assad's territory.
Yeah.
Or that's what he claimed.
Yes.
We know from the Bible that it is our territory. It's part of the tribal lands.
Shan, yeah.
Exactly. So the hypocrisy of the EU in saying, well, Israel must not have this. Well, who do you want to have this? Assad, who is bombing his own citizens, right? Iran, who is taking over Assad's country, or Russia, who's half taken it over. I mean, they're on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to do with the Palestinian narrative at all.
And what I found extraordinary is my first visit to the Golan Heights was back in the summer of '96 when I was part of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's kibbutz program for 3 months while I was at university. I've spoken about this many times before, but this is probably the most specialist time I ever visited Israel, to be there for 3 months. And what was so extraordinary was visiting the Golan Heights for the first time and visiting the city of Gamala. And to think that Gamala was a Jewish settlement or a city that stood with the Jewish revolt against the Romans and fell in AD 67. And it was discovered in 1967, and they found menorahs on the buildings, and so therefore really shows that this is part of Israel's heritage. We were also told by one of our tour guides that they learnt to plant trees from the Bible, from reading Bible scriptures regarding the Golan Heights. So it's a special place. But what does it mean for Mike Pompeo to say that this is Israel's, that Israel needs this for security? And President Trump recognized it as part of Israel's security to the benefit of the people in the Golan.
It is a message which probably will be lost on the EU, but it's a message which empowers the average Israeli and gives them pride in what they have. I've often said that we celebrate Israeli Independence Day every year with fireworks and so forth, and I often say, don't celebrate it with fireworks. Celebrate by acting as if it's ours. Stop behaving like some kind of a passenger who hasn't paid for his ticket on the train and hiding in the toilet, right? This is really what it comes down to at its basic. And the more activity that we do in Judea and Samaria, the more those facts will become clear to everyone concerned.
So let's see now US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo talking with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at this press conference.
Mr. Prime Minister, it's an honor and a joy to be here with you today. Last night I had a chance to walk through the city of David. Today you and I met looking out over the old city. The peace, the increased prosperity, and the reduced risk to citizens all across the world and in the region, and to here in the Jewish homeland that we have accomplished together is historic, and you should be proud that you have led your people in this direction. And President Trump, I know, is proud of the work that we have done alongside of you. We've done incredible things. It's remarkable. You went through the list, whether it's the simple fact of recognizing the reality of Jerusalem as the rightful, proper, true capital of Israel. Crazy that the United States hadn't done this for decades. And then we moved our embassy there. How simple, how right, how just. I remember the stories when I was serving in Congress that if we did this, there would be war. But in fact, peace is what has followed. Today I'll get a chance to visit the Golan Heights. The simple recognition of this as part of Israel, too, was a decision President Trump made that is historically important and simply a recognition of the reality. And then you talked about the fact that for a long time the State Department took the wrong view of settlements. It took a view that didn't recognize the history of this special place. And instead, now today, the United States Department of State stands strongly to the recognition that settlements can be done in a way that are lawful and appropriate and proper. I'm proud of the 3 Abraham Accords. I'm hopeful and confident there will be more. It was because of your good work, because of the good work of the American team. It was because of great leaders in those 3 countries who did the right thing. And I'm confident that this will continue. It will continue because people are demanding peace. People have come to recognize all across this region that the right thing to do is recognize the state of Israel as appropriate and proper and a great, wonderful partner for all things economic and academic and security. I am confident that this one-way movement, this one-way ratchet towards peace will continue. Today I want to make one announcement with respect to a decision by the State Department that we will regard the global anti-Israel BDS campaign as anti-Semitic. I know this sounds simple to you, Mr. Prime Minister. It seems like a statement of fact, but I want you to know that we will immediately take steps to identify organizations that engage in hateful BDS conduct and withdraw U.S. government support for such groups. The time is right.
It doesn't sound simple. It sounds simply wonderful to me.
Look, we want to stand with all other nations that recognize the BDS movement for the cancer that it is, and we're committed to combating it. Our record speaks for itself. During the Trump administration, America stands with Israel like never before. Indeed, the commitment we've made, the ironclad commitment we've made to the Jewish state will continue. I'm confident that after our conversation this morning, we talked about how we can protect Americans and Israelis in the region from the regime in Tehran. You talked about this. They remain, we should not take for granted, they remain the foremost state sponsor of terrorism in all the world. And Israel has provided outstanding support to our pressure campaign, which we have no intention of relaxing. Indeed, just yesterday, the United States unleashed a wave of new sanctions on senior regime officials, an arm of the regime's oppression that poses a charitable foundation. It's known as Mashar. These actions mark the 1-year anniversary of the regime's massacre of its own citizens in the city of Mashar, citizens who were peacefully protesting their government's corruption and abuses. We stand with the Iranian people against those abuses. We want peace and security for the entire region and for Israel in every respect. These landmark agreements we've secured over these last handful of weeks give new hope that Israelis and Palestinians can end their conflict. I also conveyed to the Prime Minister our support for the decision by the governments of Israel and Lebanon to begin discussions on the maritime boundary, for which we are acting as a mediator and facilitator. We hope that this long-standing dispute can be resolved. The negotiation has the potential to yield increased stability, security, and prosperity for both Israeli citizens and those in Lebanon as well. One more point. In August of this year, the United States supported the renewal of the UNIFIL mission, but we demanded some important conditions, and for good reason. For far too long, Hezbollah has enjoyed near total freedom of movement through UNIFIL's mandated areas of control. And with Iran's support, has built up an arsenal of weapons, fired missiles into Israel, dug attack tunnels underneath the Lebanon-Israel border, and more. The United States cannot abide by these actions against our trusted friend. The most recent renewal of the mandate included new reporting requirements on those attacks against peacekeepers and investigations of access denials. We are hopeful that these important steps will ensure UNIFIL can be a multilateral mission that actually fulfills its mandate. If not, we'll have to move in a different direction. Mr. Prime Minister, it's always an honor to be here with you and to visit Israel. This is a place that has a special place in my heart and the heart of so many Americans. Bless you. Thank you for your good work alongside the Trump administration. I wish all of us many, many more years of successful partnership between our two countries. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. I think we can do this. This is as far as we can go. Thank you.
And we really have to salute US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Not only is he a strong Christian, but he's a Christian Zionist with a love for Israel and the Jewish people. And how great it would be to see a British Foreign Secretary behave in such ways. So let's continue to pray for that. Robin, we need to really discuss in the last 4 minutes of the programme essentially the alternative now, because it looks very likely that Biden-Harris administration will be the next presidency of the United States of America. And essentially this is what Kamala Harris, his vice president, has said. She said that we are committed to a two-state solution, and we will oppose any unilateral steps that undermine that goal. We also oppose the annexation and settlement expansions. So how difficult do you think it will be for the Jewish settlers and Israel with a Biden/Harris administration in the White House?
Well, I think the settlers are already disappointed because the current government has put the whole extending sovereignty issue well away on, in fact, not even on the back burner. It's off the hot plate at the moment. So they're already disappointed. If they know that Biden and Harris are coming in, and this is the sort of statements that she's making, then they know that they're going to be up against it. They know there's going to be resistance. But I would want to put in the point, something that you mentioned earlier on, they then come up against the Word of God and the prophecy of Joel that God will enter into judgment with those who divide the land. And from my perspective, that's the point I would want to make. If Biden and Harris want to go down that route, then they need to be prepared to pay the price and live with the consequences of taking America down that route, and it will have a national consequence.
Absolutely. And Selmy, I also want to go on saying that it's only really a question of time before we see Kamala Harris as America's president. This is what she said on the Palestinian issue, that she wants to reverse so many of President Trump's Middle Eastern policies. She said, we'll take immediate steps to restore economic and humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, addressing the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, reopen the US consulate in East Jerusalem, and work to reopen the PLO's mission in Washington. How difficult do you think it will be for Prime Minister Netanyahu to work with Kamala Harris if she becomes president? And I think it's only a question of time.
It's a question of time as to, we have to wait and see what of all this rhetoric actually is done. But I think really, I tried to compare this to the last days of Obama. And I believe that if we survived 8 years of someone like Obama, I think Harris will be a pushover. I think that what Trump and Pompeo have achieved in this short period of time is much of it is there to stay. We look forward to the next conservative leader of the free world to build on what Trump has so amazingly done.
Excellent. Zalmi and Robin, thank you so much for being my guests on the Middle East Report, and I want to thank you for watching this programme today. What a brilliant Secretary of State we have in Mike Pompeo, and what President Trump has done for Israel and the Jewish people. We can only thank them, because these are born-again believers that are Christian Zionists who have a heart and a passion and a love for God's land and God's people, and they demonstrate that through their own foreign policy decisions that makes Israel a stronger place, that empowers the Jewish people. And this can only be a good thing. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.